This is a public lecture I gave at Randolph-Macon College in February 2018. The Hope of Immunotherapy, Curing Cancer 100 Years Ago and Today, Rene Chee. Tonight I'll be talking about cancer immunotherapy. Cancer, as you know, is one of the leading causes of death worldwide. For decades, the primary tools doctors have against cancer, which are surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, have largely remained powerless against advanced cancer. However, in recent years, there's been a major breakthrough in cancer medicine, a treatment known as immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is the harnessing of our own immune system to kill cancer, wherever it may be in our body. Tonight, I'm going to talk about immunotherapy from its beginnings 100 years ago to the present day. I'll explain some of the science behind immunotherapy, and I'll show you the tremendous hope that immunotherapy is giving to terminal cancer patients, that a cure may finally be possible. I'm going to start by taking us on a journey back to New York City in the 1890s. Dr. William Coley was a Harvard-trained surgeon who practiced at Memorial Hospital in New York. The hospital would go on to become the world-renowned Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Early in his career, he had a patient by the name of Bessie DeShiel, a young lady whose right hand had become trapped in between two seats on the train. The accident caused a bruise on the back of her hand, which eventually developed into a painful mass. Dr. Coley performed a biopsy, which revealed that she had cancer, specifically a sarcoma, which is a cancer of the connective tissues. Dr. Coley amputated her beneath the elbow in an attempt to contain the cancer, but it was too late. Her cancer had already spread beyond her hand. Within a month, tumors appeared on her breast, then on her abdomen. Then her whole body became riddled with numerous small tumors, from head to toe. Bessie died 4 months after she first saw Dr. Coley, at the age of 18. The viciousness of Bessie's cancer deeply impacted Dr. Coley. It moved him to devote his career to treating cancer. Back then, surgery was the only treatment for cancer. There was no radiation or chemotherapy. So Dr. Coley began looking at the records of cancer patients treated by his mentor, Dr. Boole, perhaps hoping to learn something useful from these cases. One particular case stood out to him. The patient was a German immigrant by the name of Fred Stein. Mr. Stein also had a sarcoma, the same kind of cancer as Bessie DeShiel's. Dr. Boole, Coley's mentor, had surgically removed Mr. Stein's tumor, which was on the left side of his face in front of his ear. But within 3 months it had grown back again, and another surgery was done. But after 2 years, the tumor grew back yet again. This time it had regrown into a 4.5-inch wide mass that looked like a bunch of grapes. Dr. Boole could not surgically remove all the tumor, as it had become entangled with a major blood vessel. The gaping wound was so big that it could not be covered up with skin grafts, so it became infected. Dr. Boole declared the case absolutely hopeless. He had done all that he could do to remove the tumor with surgery, and that time there were no other treatments available, such as radiation or chemotherapy. In other words, Mr. Stein had terminal cancer and would soon die. A week after Mr. Stein's surgery, he developed high fever and a bright red rash across his face. His wound had become infected with erysipelas, which is a bacterial infection. This happened in 1884, 44 years before the discovery of penicillin, when hospitals were torn down in order to decontaminate bacterial infections. So now, not only did Mr. Stein have a life-threatening cancer, but he also had a life-threatening bacterial infection. But a very amazing thing was soon to happen. After each flare-up of the bacterial infection, his tumor shrank a little and the wound healed a little. After 4 months, the tumor completely disappeared and the gaping wound fully healed. Mr. Stein was then discharged from the hospital. After having read Mr. Stein's case report, Dr. Coley decided to track Mr. Stein down and was able to find him. With his own eyes, Dr. Coley witnessed that this once terminal cancer patient was indeed cancer-free and in good health. This occurred 7 years after Mr. Stein had been discharged from the hospital. To find a once terminal cancer patient alive and well 7 years later was nothing short of a medical miracle. Even today, terminal sarcoma is an incurable disease where patients normally die within the year. Betsy DeShield's horrible death had imparted a feeling of helplessness against cancer. But Mr. Stein's remarkable healing gave Dr. Coley a sense of hope that terminal cancer could be cured. Hoping to reproduce Mr. Stein's success, Dr. Coley began infecting patients with the same bacteria that had infected Mr. Stein. However, a couple of patients died from live infections, so Dr. Coley began to refine his treatment through a process of trial and error. His treatment became known as Coley's toxins. His final formulation consisted of bacteria killed with heat. The dead bacteria could no longer cause an infection in the body. But even though the bacteria was dead, it still had an effect on the cancer. Over the years, Dr. Coley found that the best results were achieved by following certain practices. The first was that he needed to inject Coley's toxins directly into tumors, not just some other part of the body. He also found the need to inject enough toxins to generate a fever above 103 degrees. Lower fevers were associated with poor results. Lastly, the treatment needed to be given every other day for 6 months or more, depending on how the cancer was responding. Over Dr. Coley's 40-year career, he treated around 1,000 patients with his toxins. About 500 of them had near-complete regressions. Some patients with terminal cancer were documented alive and disease-free decades later. Terminal cancer patients typically don't survive very long, perhaps a few months to a year. This is true even with today's standard therapies like radiation and chemo. So, the long-term survival of Dr. Coley's terminal patients offers evidence that a cure for cancer is possible. Until the 1930s, Coley's toxins were the only known systemic therapy for cancer. It was also used by conventional cancer doctors, such as the Mayo Brothers of the Mayo Clinic. But Coley's toxins eventually fell out of use. Firstly, because it was not easy to administer. Patients with high fevers would have to be monitored for over 8 hours every other day, and this would have to be done over a period of 6 months. Secondly, the rise of radiation in the 1900s and chemo in the 1950s quickly overshadowed Coley's toxins. This was mainly because radiation and chemo both were easy to administer. Also, tumor shrinkage occurs quickly after treatment, even though the cancer usually later returns. Today, we would be completely in the dark about Coley's toxins were it not for the efforts of a remarkable woman, Helen Coley Knotts, Dr. Coley's daughter. After Dr. Coley died, Helen decided to write a biography of her father. That's when she came across Dr. Coley's patient files. Helen recognized the significance of her father's discoveries and resolved to meticulously document all of her father's cases. She tracked down patients and documented their outcomes in a series of monographs. These monographs have preserved important evidence for us that terminal cancer patients can be cured. And to validate the science behind her father's work, Helen founded the Cancer Research Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization that has funded cancer immunology research since the 1950s until today. My life intersected with Coley's toxins with this particular monograph that contains the records of sarcoma patients treated by Dr. Coley. My husband and I found this in the basement of the Stanford Medical Library, where I was a postdoc researcher in biology. We tracked out the monograph with great anticipation because I had been diagnosed with cancer, specifically synovial sarcoma, which is a similar type of cancer to what Bessie DeShiel and Fred Stein had. In 2008, accelerating symptoms of pain and numbness on the right side of my face led to an MRI scan. A tumor the size of an egg was found deep inside my head, right next to my jawbone. It was pressing against my throat, the base of my skull, and causing my jaw to jut out of position. The tumor was taken out by surgery. It was a highly malignant and rare sarcoma. This picture was taken just after my surgery, where you might be able to see the 5-inch incision along my neck crease going up to my ear. During the surgery, the tumor broke apart and spilled, leaving microscopic cancer cells in my head. Because of the remaining microscopic cancer, I had radiation, which I represent here in green, which is a local treatment that focuses high-energy radiation beams to the area of microscopic cancer cells. However, healthy tissue is also damaged by radiation. To achieve precise targeting, my head was locked down with a blue plastic mesh onto the table, as you can see in this picture. By the end of 30 daily radiation sessions, I had to take painkillers just to swallow water. Even though my scans were clean at the time, my doctors told me that there was a high chance microscopic cancer had already spread to other parts of my body. To attack those microscopic cancer cells, I was given chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, which I represent in green here, is a systemic treatment as it is infused into the entire body. The chemo I was given indiscriminately kills all cells that divide: hair cells, skin cells, immune cells, and hopefully cancer cells. The chemo was so toxic that I wasn't allowed to walk the hallways while it dripped into me, as a spill would be hazardous to others. At the end of a year of torturous treatment, there were still no other tumors on my scans. My doctor told me to go back to a normal life. However, my husband Eddie dug deeper into scientific journals. He wanted to know what happens to synovial sarcoma patients who had also completed all these standard treatments. Eddie learned that of patients who had done the same treatments that I had just completed, 60% of them would be dead within 5 years. What did this actually mean? It meant that within 5 years, 60% of patients like me would experience the return of their cancer, and then they would eventually die when multiplying tumors shut the body down, or they would die from increasingly destructive treatment side effects. The statistics told us that there was a high chance all those treatments I had just gone through had failed to kill off all the cancer in my body. I most likely still had microscopic cancer cells in my body. We felt like we needed to immediately do something to attack the remaining microscopic cancer. But what could we do? My doctor had no more treatments for me. In desperation, we explored all sorts of supplements, diets, and alternative treatments. In all of our research, nothing stood out as much as Coley's toxins. Coley's toxin stood out because it offered evidence of terminal sarcoma patients that should have died who ended up living for decades without cancer. As a comparison, in 2012, a targeted therapy known as Votrient was hailed as the first drug approved for sarcoma in decades. In stark contrast to the long-term remission of Coley's toxins patients, Votrient only prolonged patients' lives by an average of 2 months over placebo. We were serious about pursuing Coley's toxins, but we wanted to know if those cases were in fact real and if there was any scientific basis behind Coley's toxins. We learned that there was a prominent scientist who believed in the validity of Coley's toxins. Not only did he believe in its validity, his research into Coley's toxins had apparently spurred seminal discoveries by him. These discoveries were about the interaction of the immune system and cancer. The prominent scientist's name was Dr. Lloyd Old. His interest in Coley's toxins had led to the discovery of tumor necrosis factor, a powerful protein released by immune cells to kill cancer. He also discovered p53, a gene that is mutated in almost half of all cancers. And he had identified the first CD antigens, which are surface markers on immune cells. The list went on, clearly indicating that he was a very accomplished scientist. Dr. Old had been the Associate Director of Research at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He was also leading several worldwide cancer immunology organizations, such as the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research and the Cancer Research Institute. These institutions had the scientific and financial means to conduct basic research and to run immunotherapy clinical trials. Importantly, these nonprofit institutions supported immunotherapy over many decades when it was unpopular. I updated my professor at Stanford that we were planning to seek out Dr. Old and ask him about Coley's toxins. Amazingly, she told us that she knew him personally. She immediately connected us with Dr. Old. This marked the beginning of our deep-rooted conviction in immunotherapy. Dr. Old told us he had known Helen Coley-Knotts personally, and he was leading the Cancer Research Institute that she had founded. He also told us there was a scientific basis behind Coley's toxins, and that basis was the immune system. When we have a bacterial infection, it's life-threatening when it becomes uncontrolled and overwhelms the body. However, our immune system protects us by killing off these foreign bacteria. After the threat is removed, the immune system calms down and our body returns to a normal state. Likewise, when we have cancer, our immune system also tries to protect us by killing off these cancer cells. Once all of the cancer is destroyed, our bodies are returned to a normal state. Now, let's look more closely at how the immune system learns to recognize and kill an enemy, such as bacteria, a cell infected by a virus, or a cancer cell. The immune system is very complex, so I'm just going to focus on a very small part of the immune system that pertains to cancer immunotherapy. The first immune cell I want to introduce is the dendritic cell. When there's an enemy in the body, such as bacteria or cancer, which I represent in black here, the dendritic cell encounters the enemy and engulfs it. It then digests the enemy into little fragments. Next, it presents each fragment of the enemy on its arms, which are called dendrites, hence the name dendritic cell. The dendritic cell then travels to a lymph node. Lymph nodes are part of our lymphatic system. You can think of the lymphatic system as a network of roads that moves billions of immune cells across the body. And you can think of lymph nodes as the road intersections where immune cells can meet. So, the dendritic cell travels to a lymph node to meet with T cells, which are the soldier cells of the immune system. Each T cell can recognize one specific enemy fragment. Once in the lymph node, the dendritic cell patiently waits to encounter the right T cell that's able to recognize the enemy fragment being presented on the arms of the dendritic cell. When that happens, the dendritic cell activates the T cell, causing it to multiply into more T cells. The final result is a large army of T cells that can recognize the enemy. This T cell army circulates through the whole body, killing off the enemy wherever it may be. After the threat is gone, the T cells die off, but a small number of T cells remain, becoming memory T cells. Memory T cells have a specific purpose. In the future, should the enemy return, the memory T cells will quickly activate and multiply into a large army of T cells that can once again kill the enemy. In this way, the immune system is able to mount a very specific and long-lasting attack on any enemy, such as bacteria, viruses, or even cancer. So I just showed you how the immune system can mount an effective response against cancer. But obviously, something's wrong with this process when a person develops cancer. For some reason, the immune response is just not effective. So let's look at some problems that can cause the immune system to be ineffective against cancer and some potential solutions to those problems. One problem is sometimes the T cell army doesn't get created against the cancer. So here's a reminder of how the T cell army is created. By dendritic cells multiplying T cells that recognize fragments of the cancer. Sometimes something goes wrong with this process, leading to no T cell army. So one solution scientists have developed is to artificially make a T cell army outside of the body in the lab. This technique is known as adoptive T cell therapy, of which there are two kinds known as CAR-T and TCR. The first step in adoptive therapy is to remove T cells from the patient. Next, the T cells are modified so that they can recognize the cancer. Then the T cells are multiplied into a large army, typically into tens of billions in number. Finally, this large army is reinfused back into the patient and allowed to circulate the body to attack the cancer. Another solution to the missing T cell army is to also make an army, but this time inside the body. One way to make an army inside the body is with a cancer vaccine. Cancer vaccines follow the same principle as flu vaccines. With the flu vaccine, a little bit of the flu virus is injected under the skin along with some immune stimulant. Likewise, a cancer vaccine involves injecting a protein found in the cancer along with an immune stimulant under the skin. The immune stimulant attracts the dendritic cell, which engulfs the protein. And then the dendritic cell activates specific T cells that recognize that protein, thus leading to the generation of an army of T cells that all recognize the cancer protein. Those T cells will then go all around the body, hunting down and killing cancer cells that have that protein. So here's a picture of me in 2010, eagerly awaiting my first shot of a cancer vaccine contained in those syringes in the cup. This vaccine was developed by Dr. Old's research organization and was being given to ovarian cancer patients in clinical trials. Since I didn't have ovarian cancer, I didn't qualify for those trials. But Dr. Old was able to work with a local oncologist to get me this vaccine through a clinical trial for one person, known as a single patient protocol. After a few shots of the vaccine, blood tests confirmed that I had developed T cells against the cancer protein. Even though the cancer vaccine had successfully generated some T cells against my cancer, Dr. Old warned me that this might not be enough. This is because tumors have ways to defend themselves against the immune system. That brings us to a second problem that causes the immune system to be not effective against cancer. The immune system has braking mechanisms as part of its normal functioning. These brakes exist to prevent autoimmune diseases, which can happen when our own immune system attacks healthy tissues in our body. An example of an autoimmune disease is arthritis. One of these immune brakes is called CTLA-4. Going back to the dendritic cell I described earlier, it turns out that not only can they activate T cells, but they can also cause T cells not to multiply by applying the CTLA-4 brake. So without multiplication, you don't get a T cell army. To solve this problem, scientists have developed CTLA-4 immunotherapy, which is a treatment that disrupts the CTLA-4 brake, thus allowing T cells to multiply into an army. The brand name for the CTLA-4 drug is Yervoy, and its scientific name is ipilimumab. The side effects of CTLA-4 immunotherapy are autoimmune in nature, which makes sense since CTLA-4 brake is normally used to prevent autoimmune diseases. The most common side effect is diarrhea, which can progress to intestinal perforations. Thankfully, these side effects can be managed well with steroids without negating the anti-cancer properties. We now look at a third problem that causes the immune system to be not effective against cancer. It turns out that tumors are actually able to defend themselves against T cells. This happens at the site of the tumor itself, where tumors can neutralize incoming T cells, causing T cells to shut down. This defense mechanism is called PD-1, and you can think of it as a shutdown switch that turns off T cells. To solve this problem, scientists have developed PD-1 immunotherapy. PD-1 immunotherapy disrupts the PD-1 defense mechanism, preventing T cells from being shut down when they reach the tumor. This way, the T cells can do their job and kill the tumor. There are at least 2 PD-1 immunotherapies on the market now, Opdivo and Keytruda. Their scientific names are nivolumab and pembrolizumab. The side effects of PD-1 immunotherapy are generally milder than CTLA-4 immunotherapy. A common side effect is itchy skin. A more serious side effect is lung inflammation. Thankfully, these can also be controlled with steroids without negating the anti-cancer effects. So, I've just introduced 2 immunotherapies that try to solve some of the problems preventing an effective immune response against cancer. But just how effective are these immunotherapies? Let's first look at CTLA-4, the one that releases the immune brakes. There was a lot of excitement when the CTLA-4 drug Yervoy was approved for metastatic melanoma in 2011. Melanoma is a skin cancer, and metastatic means that it's spread around the body. Before CTLA-4 was approved, This is a graph that shows the general survival for patients with metastatic melanoma treated with standard therapy. As you can see, most patients died within 1 year, and very few made it to 2 or 3 years, with the graph tapering down, meaning there were very few long-term survivors. The survival graph shows there was no hope of a cure from metastatic melanoma with standard therapies before CTLA-4. Here's a graph that shows the survival for over 2,000 patients treated with CTLA-4. 20% of patients benefited from the drug. That might seem like a modest number, but the amazing thing is that most of these patients were still alive 15 years later. But PD-1 immunotherapy benefited even more patients, with 34% of melanoma patients showing tumor regression, also long-lasting. What we're seeing here is a similar long-term survival that we saw with Dr. William Coley's patients. Time will tell how much longer these patients will survive, but it's already clear that in contrast to chemotherapy, treatments that harness the immune system against cancer are able to achieve much longer survival and give us hope of a cure. The results I just showed you were for melanoma. However, PD-1 immunotherapy has been found to be effective in many different cancers, so effective that it's been approved for all these cancers that I list here within just 4 short years. It's important to understand that unlike traditional chemo or targeted therapies, PD-1 immunotherapy works on the immune system, which is why it's broadly applicable to so many cancers. So to summarize, I've described 3 problems that cause an ineffective immune response to cancer, namely no T-cell army, the immune breaks, and the tumor defenses. I also discussed some modern immunotherapies that try to solve these problems. So now let's switch gears and go back to my journey. In 2010, I had gotten a cancer vaccine to generate T cells against one protein in my cancer. I wanted to get CTLA-4 to release the brakes and also PD-1 to remove tumor defenses. But both these therapies were still in clinical trials for other cancers, so I didn't have access. Meanwhile, we had been investigating Coley's toxins and were discussing it with Dr. Old. Dr. Old suspected Coley's toxins could have some similar effects on releasing the brakes and removing tumor defenses. He theorized that the body naturally removes these inhibitions when it's faced with a bacterial infection, which is what Coley's toxins mimics. Coley's toxins was no longer available in the US, but it so happened that at the time there was a Canadian company, MB-Vax, that was trying to revive Coley's toxins. MB-Vax was still trying to raise funds to run clinical trials in the US and Canada, but in the meantime they were legally providing Coley's toxins to clinics in Mexico. Dr. Old had also tested MB-Vax versions of Coley's toxins and found it to be potent. We did our due diligence. We spoke with patients who had gotten Coley's toxins. We studied case studies of Dr. Coley's patients, and we spoke at length with MB-Vax scientists. Finally, we gathered enough courage to go to Mexico for Coley's toxins. Here's a picture of me receiving an infusion of Coley's toxins in Mexico. I would normally receive an intravenous drip of Coley's toxins into my bloodstream late in the morning. An hour later, I would become very tired and my temperature would begin to rise. We made sure I was thoroughly bundled up to keep me warm, in order to avoid the main unpleasant side effect, which was shaking chills. To ensure my safety, Eddie would monitor me very carefully, taking my temperature and vitals every 10 minutes. The graph below shows my temperature during 2 consecutive coletoxins fevers. By the 3rd or 4th hour, my fever would peak, usually at 103 degrees, and I would be completely exhausted at this point. Soon afterwards, my temperature would start to drop as my immune system began to clear out the dead bacterial fragments from my bloodstream. By the 6th hour, I would usually be around 100 degrees, and I would feel strong enough to get up and have dinner. Similar to Dr. Coley's patients 100 years ago, I would have a big appetite after the fever, as you can see here. The duration of my fevers was so predictable that I could even schedule dinner at set times with my newfound friends at the Mexican hospital. Eddie and I were so excited that we were taking concrete action to kill off any microscopic cancer cells in my body. We hoped Coley's toxins would complement the cancer vaccine I had received earlier. However, shortly after I started Coley's toxins, my jaw tumor recurred. It was a terrifying time for us because the prognosis for sarcoma that has returned is very poor. But I had just begun Coley's toxins, and we felt that we hadn't given it enough time to work, as Dr. Coley had treated his patients for 6 months or longer. So we pressed on with Coley's toxins, hoping it would work. A month later, a scan showed that my tumor had hollowed out. Elated, we believed we had succeeded in harnessing that same powerful anti-cancer effect that Dr. Coley had achieved 100 years earlier. Unfortunately, after about 2 more months of Coley's toxins, the scan showed that my tumor was back again. This devastated us, as it implied Coley's toxins was no longer working against my cancer. What could have gone wrong? We asked ourselves. One difference was that I had received Coley's toxins intravenously into my bloodstream, whereas Dr. Coley directly injected it into tumors. Perhaps that was why it wasn't working. After much thought, we decided that immunotherapy was the only strategy that offered a potential cure. So we resolved to continue our strategy. One possible weakness in our strategy was that the cancer vaccine I had received earlier makes a T-cell army against one protein on the cancer cell. So we decided to pursue another treatment that would make a T-cell army against all proteins found on the cancer cell. How could we do this? We could do this with cryoablation. Cryoablation is a procedure that freezes a tumor in the body, thus killing it. This is achieved by inserting a special needle into a tumor. Liquid argon gas at a temperature of negative 292 degrees is passed through the needle, causing the tissue surrounding the needle tip to freeze and die. So how does cryoablation make a T-cell army? Remember how cancer vaccines work? A cancer vaccine makes a T-cell army against one protein in the cancer. Well, cryoablation essentially causes the same effect, but the difference is it can make a T-cell army against all the proteins found in the cancer. So here's how cryoablation can make a T-cell army. When the tumor, which I represent here in black, is treated with a cryoablation needle, which I represent here in blue, the tumor is frozen to death and then left in the body. The frozen tumor becomes a very attractive target for the dendritic cell. As a result, the dendritic cell generates a T-cell army that recognizes all proteins from the tumor, not just one protein, as in the case of the cancer vaccine. Here I am, shortly after cryoablation of my recurrent jaw tumor. You might be able to make out the 4 tiny pinprick marks on my right cheek. These tiny holes were where the doctor inserted 4 cryoablation needles to encompass my tumor. As you can see, it's a a very minimally invasive procedure. The dead cryoablated tumor is still inside my head, which I represent with the gray pentagon in the schematic. So at this point, I had cryoablated the recurrent tumor in my jaw and was hoping that it would create a T-cell army against all tumor proteins. But since the stakes were so high, we wanted to be extra sure that we had done everything possible to create that army. So we looked into what else we could do. The cryoablation had made my dead tumor an attractive target for dendritic cells. However, to ensure that the dendritic cells would do their job, we decided to go to Germany for an immunotherapy called dendritic cell therapy. Recall that one of the ways scientists can make large number of T cells is by removing some T cells from the patient, multiplying them in the lab, and then putting them back into the patient. Similarly, dendritic cell therapy is where dendritic cells are removed from the patient, activated and multiplied in the lab, and then finally injected back into the patient. So, a few weeks after my jaw tumor was cryoablated in Detroit, Eddie and I flew to Germany where I received dendritic cell therapy. This picture shows me hooked up to a machine that extracted my dendritic cells. My dendritic cells would be processed in a lab and injected back into me a week later. At this point, Eddie and I felt we had done everything possible. That is, whatever we had access to, in order to address the three problems that could prevent an effective immune response against cancer. We continued on with this strategy, returning to Germany every 6 weeks and doing cholecystectomies every day or two, even when we were traveling. All this while, we were hoping the cryoablation would have destroyed most of my recurrent jaw tumor and that the immunotherapies would take care of any remaining microscopic tumor. But less than 5 months after the cryoablation, an MRI revealed yet another recurrence of my jaw tumor. This recurrence was just outside of the cryoablated dead tumor. We were devastated. The recurrent tumor was right next to my jaw joint. This time, we could not cryoablate it, as it was too close to the carotid artery, soon to become inoperable. Because of the dangerous location, we couldn't afford to wait for immunotherapy to work. So we decided to cut it out. Multiple surgeons told us it was impossible to get all of the cancer with surgery. The reason is because sarcomas have invasive microscopic tentacles that extend far beyond the visible tumor. Despite the apparent futility of surgery, we made the extremely difficult decision to ask for the most aggressive surgery possible, to remove not only the tumor, but also my jaw joint, jawbone, and all the surrounding tissues. I wasn't ready to go down without a fight. Even though it was drastic, the surgery unexpectedly gave us a very important piece of information. When the tumor showed up as a 1 centimeter mass on the scan, everyone assumed that the cancer was fully cancerous, packed with about 1 billion cancer cells, which I represent here in red. However, when the pathologist analyzed the tumor after surgery, he saw something interesting. Only 1/2 of the cells were cancer. The other half were immune cells, which I represent here in blue. Furthermore, some of the cancer cells were dead, which I represent here in black. This finding strongly suggested my immune system was actually attacking the cancer and had even managed to kill some of it. This tangible evidence of tumor cells being killed by my immune system gave us hope and resolve to continue with our immunotherapy strategy. This resolve would become crucial because I soon found out that the cancer had spread to my lungs. I now had metastatic sarcoma, where most patients don't survive past 1 year. So despite my dismal prognosis, Eddie and I knew that my only hope of surviving was to keep pursuing more immunotherapy. Changing strategy at this point to standard treatment of high-dose chemo would not only lead to a dead end, as the data showed, but also it would hurt my immune system and compromise any chance of making immunotherapy work. And so, Eddie and I dug in and kept doing what we were already doing. I went back to Detroit to cryoablate my lung tumor. I also continued going to Germany for more dendritic cell therapy every 6 weeks. And all the while, I kept on getting high fevers from Coley's toxins every 1 or 2 days, even while traveling. Our resolve would be increasingly tested when a second and a third tumor started popping up in different areas of my lungs in accelerating fashion. I treated each tumor in the same way, with cryoablation, more dendritic cell therapy, and more Coley's toxins. The intense regimen continued for 2 years. Finally, after my third lung cryo, I was feeling unwell. I was also discouraged by the accelerating tumor growth in my lungs. Eddie and I believed that too much Coley's toxins and dendritic cell therapy was overstimulating my immune system, leading to a state of chronic inflammation and making me feel unwell. Too much of a good thing isn't always good. This is also true of immune stimulation, as chronic inflammation can actually cause tumors to grow. So we decided to switch gears and to quell the chronic inflammation in my body. The technique we used to quell chronic inflammation was by a simple dietary intervention. Firstly, I strictly controlled intake of inflammatory omega-6 oils, such as corn oil, soybean oil, peanut oil, including all foods that contain large amounts of these oils, which would include almost all nuts, fried foods, and many processed foods. Secondly, I took a very large amount of anti-inflammatory omega-3 fish oil daily. That was back in July 2013. No further lung tumors have appeared since then. A fourth lung tumor that we have been tracking on my CT scans subsequently disappeared without needing to be cryoablated. It's now been 4.5 years since the last sign of tumor, and 10 years since my diagnosis. Having given you an overview of my personal experience with immunotherapy, I would like to now present a dramatic example of an immune response to cancer. I hope this example will impress on you why it's important not to give up, even when immunotherapy doesn't seem to be working. This gentleman had advanced melanoma and a huge tumor on his neck measuring 18 by 15 by 8 centimeters. His oncologist had already given him both CTLA-4 and PD-1 immunotherapies, but his tumor had not responded. Despite the seeming failure of these two cutting-edge immunotherapies, his doctor didn't give up. Instead, he prescribed radiation to the patient's tumor, followed by more PD-1 immunotherapy. This is a picture of the patient 5 months after his radiation treatment, when he also got PD-1 immunotherapy. Amazing, isn't it? It's believed that the radiation created T cells against the patient's cancer, just like cryoablation or a vaccine would. After the T cells were created with radiation, only then was PD-1 able to work, removing the tumor defenses. But PD-1 did not work before the radiation. This case demonstrates to us that several aspects of the immune response are necessary in order for an effective immune response. Researchers and doctors are finding that combinations of immunotherapy treatments aiming to generate a complete immune response are leading to better results. So, what immunotherapy is available today? When I began my immunotherapy journey, CTLA-4 and PD-1 were not available, so I had to go to Mexico to get Coley's toxins. Unfortunately, the Canadian company that made Coley's toxins has since run out of funding, so there's no reliable source of Coley's toxins today to my knowledge. But ever since CTLA-4 was approved in 2011 and PD-1 approved in 2014, cancer immunotherapy has exploded into mainstream medicine. CTLA-4 and PD-1 are FDA approved for certain cancers. In those cases, your insurance may cover it. Even if CTLA-4 or PD-1 are not approved for your specific cancer, you can receive it as off-label treatment. Off-label treatment is when your doctor prescribes a treatment that's not yet approved for your cancer, but already approved for a different cancer. I also want to point out that CTLA-4 and PD-1, as well as many other immunotherapies such as cancer vaccines and adoptive T-cell therapy, are available through clinical trials. Because of immunotherapy's great promise, there are hundreds of clinical trials for all kinds of cancers. I would like to highlight two resources for finding immunotherapy clinical trials. The first is the official U.S. government clinical trial website, clinicaltrials.gov. There, you can search by treatment, the type of cancer, or by keyword. The second is Cancer Research Institute's Clinical Trial Finder at cancerresearch.org. This is the organization that Dr. William Coley's daughter started. This research is amazing as they have actual people that can help patients find immunotherapy clinical trials. Next, I want to point out that radiation is widely available, and there are a few doctors in the US who perform cryoablation. These two treatments are very useful for creating T cells against your cancer. Finally, a very exciting development is that there are now trials that combine multiple immunotherapy treatments in order to achieve a complete immune response against cancer. Remember the CTLA-4 survival curve? About 20% of patients experience long-term survival, and this number increased to 34% for PD-1. The hope is that by combining various immunotherapies to generate a complete immune response, this number will increase even higher. So, compared to just a few years ago, this is an extremely hopeful and exciting time for cancer patients who once had no hope. All thanks to a doctor from a century ago who followed up on a case of cancer remission after bacterial infection and showed us that terminal cancer can be eliminated, which led to modern-day researchers deciphering the science of cancer immunology and developing immunotherapies that have given cancer patients such as this gentleman and myself hope that a cure for cancer may finally be possible. Thank you very much.